shouldn't it? Just leave your rubbers out of it, you know? Hello and welcome to Synapse. Today we're discussing stress in our profession and how to deal with it. All professions have some degree of stress in the workplace, but it's recognised that levels of stress and depression are higher amongst doctors and medical students than in nearly any other occupation. Yet doctors often find it very difficult to ask for help, regarding it as a sign of weakness. Just how common is it? Are we our own worst enemies in the way that we work? And are there ways that we deal with stress more effectively? Joining me today to discuss this important issue are Dr. Len Featherstone, who is the chairman of GP Choices, a Durham-based occupational health scheme for primary care workers, Dr. David Wainwright, a research fellow from the University of Kent, and Dr. Liz Armstrong, a GP who runs the Doctors Support Network, a grassroots organisation offering self-help to doctors. David, I believe that you've done some research on stress levels in primary care. Just how common is stress in doctors?
Well, I think it varies tremendously. The aggregate level we got was a rate of 30% of GPs were suffering from psychiatric distress, minor psychiatric distress. That was matched by practice managers who were also at about 30%. The nurses did a little better, about 20% of those were suffering from stress, and the lowest levels of stress were in the administrative workers. But what we found was that the incidence or the prevalence of stress varied tremendously from practice to practice. So in one practice you'd have just 10% of the staff could be classified as cases of psychiatric distress, but in another maybe it was over 40%. So there's this tremendous difference.
What do you define as psychiatric distress?
Well, in the survey stage of the study we used an instrument called the General Health Questionnaire, which lists minor psychiatric symptoms, and if people score 4 or more of those, then they're classed as cases of psychiatric distress. But as I say, it varied tremendously from one practice to another. And we thought that that would be to do with things like practice size, list size, whether there was social deprivation or not. But when we looked at practices more closely in the follow-up study, we found that that wasn't the case, that you'd have objectively very similar practices in terms of their list size and deprivation. But the people there would report very different levels of stress. So it was to do more with the sort of organisational culture of the practice rather than those objective factors or workload.
Is our job really stressful? Or are we just not equipped to or are we just not equipped to cope with it, Liz?
I think we're not equipped to cope for it. I think we're not taught how to recognise emotions as medical students. We're taught to submerge them. And we have to put on this big macho face that I'm a doctor, I can cope, whatever you make me do, I will be the perfect medical person. And it's simply not like that because we have varying capacities. Some people can cope with stress more easily than others. And at the moment, there's really only 2 goals. You have to be a consultant or you have to be a GP principal. And it may not suit everybody.
Do you agree with the research that David talked about?
I certainly do. I mean, having talked to him before, there's an interesting thing there because in many studies you have a very different level of distress when you do anonymous studies than when you do studies on a face-to-face level. And it's even when faced with a medical researcher, doctors still have to deny their emotions. Certainly we find in the Doctors Support Network, this is a group for doctors with mental health problems. And the relief that doctors finding other doctors to talk to about their mental health is tremendous. And that's really one of the things that we can offer. Everybody is a doctor and everybody has had mental health problems. And that makes the group unique.
Len, you were a general practitioner. Is our job really stressful?
No, I don't think it is unduly stressful, but I think one of the problems is GPs are self-selected obsessional personalities. And so I think we're we're set up for developing symptoms of stress. We don't handle criticism very well, and we don't learn, or we're not taught to handle negative emotions very well, and so we suppress them. And then I think we generate the symptoms of stress that come up in things such as this. So I think that's one problem. And I think that, in fact, the difference between practices is to do with teams. If you look in a factory, the highest sickness rates are where you have a not so good manager in the department. You know, this is well authenticated. So I think that, in fact, it's part of a team thing. And where you have a practice that has a good team spirit, they absorb the pressures and they support each other and they convert them into challenges. But I think the ability to seek help is actually a sign of maturity, and it's driven out of us in med school, and you have to learn it again the hard way when you get into practice.
Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about GP choices and what you have to offer.
Well, it started because the department said the health authorities could spend money on GPs who are independent contractors. It was because I think we'd become an endangered species and they thought they might be short of us. And so from that, County Durham Health Authority were looking at trying to do this. And it sort of floated. I worked there as a part-time medical advisor, and it floated across my desk several times until eventually I was asked to do a short paper, and then the next thing I knew, I'd found a job. So it never does to answer questions when you work for a medical.
What actually do you offer GPs?
Well, I put things in what I call 3 phases. There's first aid, secondary care, and prevention. And the first aid basically is starting off with doctors, which is where we did it initially. We developed support doctors across the county, different sex, ethnicity, age groups, and another one north and south outside the county for total confidentiality. And any GP can approach one of those support doctors and find a listening ear, support and sympathy, and I fund the service without knowing who's being treated. The second thing is they can contact me directly, and because I'd been in the medical advisor and a lot of time in the LMC, I was well known, and so in fact I acquired work. And the third way of getting people who were in trouble was networking. So if a doctor had complaints against them, then I might ring them up and say, you know, how we're doing, do you want to chat about it, etc. And so when we set the service up, we thought we'd have a 2% contact rate. And we ended up with 30 doctors in the first 9 months, which is about a 10% contact rate. And it has continued to work up since then.
Liz, what are the signs of stress? What are the first signs that you can see?
The first signs, I think people start to get irritable. They find that they're losing their temper with their colleagues, things that didn't bother them normally, they're finding irritating. And on the other side, when they finish their work, they go home and they do nothing. Instead of being able to go out with their friends, they're just sitting there in front of the television, doing nothing, maybe having a drink or whatever. And those are the early signs, and it's those losing your outside interests that we need to start recognising as actually signs of stress. Because if somebody came to us and said they were not going out in the evening, they were losing their temper at work, we'd automatically put them in that category. But it's, you say, this business about being able to see it in ourselves and being able to have someone else to tell us that.
Is it just dealing with patients that doctors find stressful, or is it other aspects of the job as well?
I think it's to do with frustration. It's stressful when you try and arrange something for a patient and the waiting list 6 months. It's stressful when you've done your day's work and there's a mound of paperwork that you have to fill in. And also, patients' expectations are now very different from what they were. And that certainly removes some of the satisfaction.
David, with all the recent changes in primary care, do you think it's going to get worse?
I think it's very difficult to say. I mean, to come back to Liz's point, I think there's a tremendous variation in people's tolerance of stressors. I mean, Liz said that she thought doctors wouldn't be willing to speak to me about stress. I found that some of them, you know, I could barely get out of the door because they wanted to talk about it so much. But what was interesting was that they were often in a very similar situation to people who were fine with their job. You know, it's how you explain that variation in tolerance, I think, that's interesting. And why it is that, you know, one doctor will say dealing with out-of-hours cases is incredibly stressful and another won't find it a problem.
That's not, we're all different. So, I mean, the difference is simply that we're different people.
But the question is there something inherent in general practice that is that stressful that it's unreasonable to expect people to cope with? Or is it that the personality variations which means that some people are unsuited to the job.
I think that's right, and I think the job can be quite uniform, and that some people are better suited perhaps to more part-time jobs. Some people can cope with on-call better than others. And there is a great deal of variation between people.
Well, there's a tendency to increasingly medicalise what are really fairly minor frustrations. I mean, people talk about their relationship with patients and, you know, the patient has sworn at the receptionist or something like that, or banged their fist on the table when they're speaking to the doctor. I mean, that's extremely irritating and it can be upsetting. But is it really stressful? I mean, I was speaking to a surgeon who worked for Médecins Sans Frontières at a conference recently, and he said he'd been sewing up bullet wounds by torchlight in a tent with people shooting at him. And he said after that, anything which British general practice throws at you is going to seem pretty mild by comparison. You know, so it's quite relative. And I think there's a danger that we medicalise what are really fairly minor frustrations and sort of lower people's resilience as a result of that. And they become sensitised to what are really just relatively minor problems.
I think a lot goes back to the way we're taught at medical school. I don't think there's any consideration taken of how we deal with stress. And I think most young doctors come out feeling that they shouldn't be stressed and they're not allowed to show it, and they certainly have no coping techniques for it. And perhaps education has a large part to play in actually helping us from the outset to deal with what might be a stressful job in the long term.
But there's a danger that you make people afraid of their own body. I mean, if you're faced by something that's challenging or demanding, your body reacts to gear you up and produces adrenaline and gives you that adrenaline rush to help you cope with these things. Yeah, but there's a sort of tendency now for, if someone experiences that they feel they have to go and sit in a darkened room until it passes. They actually ought to use that to make them do their job more effectively, I think.
I think we're looking at two sides of one coin, and that's stress and challenge. And when it's my idea and I'm in control, it's challenge. When I'm not in control and I can't deal with the situation, then it becomes stressful. Work is challenging when you're going out doing on-call work at night because it can be exciting. But if it is frustrating because a lot of it is unnecessary or because you can't get the support you need to deal with the problem, then it becomes stressful. But in fact, it's just often which side of the coin you're looking at. And sometimes all you have to do is turn the coin a little bit and people become a bit more optimistic.
Is the government doing anything to help us, do you think?
No, but the government have never done anything to help people. I mean, basically speaking, one mustn't expect the government to solve the problem. If we want a better health service, we've got to solve the problems, and then hopefully the government will hear what we're saying. I think now with PCGs, etc., although they make a lot of extra work and meetings and committees, they do give us the opportunity to be back in control. And what we've got to keep doing is stop ministers and MPs from wanting to name, shame and batter somebody every time something goes wrong. When something goes wrong, look at it, find out what the fault was and put it right. When you have an engine crashes on the railways, they have an inquiry and they find out what went wrong and they stop it happening next time. They don't shoot the driver. Well, not necessarily.
I think many GPs would disagree with that. I think a lot of us feel we are being shot at the moment.
But do you think general practice is really harder now than it was 30 or 40 years ago? I mean, the out-of-hours issue has been resolved now for most GPs. They don't deliver babies at home. They're usually part of a large group practice that can provide cover. I mean, if you speak to some older GPs, they say, oh, you know, younger GPs have it easy. Why are they whining about stress?
But delivering babies is wonderful.
Of course
it's really
is. It's very satisfying.
It's one of the most satisfying things you can do in medicine, delivering babies.
You ride near the edge and you get away with it. One day, of course, you ride near the edge and you don't get away with it.
But it's tremendously satisfying, and it's those moments that made general practice
much more satisfying than working in a maternity unit in hospital.
Absolutely. Signing forms and filling in government directives is not satisfying.
This is the point, though.
It's frustrating, and that is stressful.
That stress isn't about workload. It's about people medicalising things that they don't like, which is filling in forms. You know, I mean, I don't like filling in forms.
But you've got to use a word. You've got to use some word to describe this awful feeling you get next time you look at your in-tray.
I mean, it's medicalising things that used to be about professional power and professional politics. I mean, GPs used to be in a position where they could say, we're not going to do this because we're a self-regulating profession and we're going to run it and decide how we want it to be. Now they're not in a position where they're able to say that anymore. So all of these minor frustrations and quibbles and irritants are becoming medicalised. They say, oh, we can't do this because it's causing us stress and, you know, it'll lead to...
I agree, absolutely. You know, that medicalising problems is a way of individualising the political. And I certainly think that we should be making this political rather than calling it stress. But this still describes, you've got to use a word that describes that awful feeling when the tray of forms, the tray of trivia, seems unending.
But
You need a
I'm afraid
word.
that's all we've got time for now. Please join us again after the break when we'll be looking at practical ways of dealing with stress. And then go straight into ways of actually dealing with stressful situations.
And dealing with,
Prevention.
Well, prevention, yeah.
I think first of all, is accepting.
Yeah, we can, if you
I,
want to
I
say.
wonder, yeah, because I think that's the most important part of it from an occupational health point of view.
Getting and
Right.
prevent it. Yeah. I absolutely agree with
20 seconds. Welcome back to today's Synapse, where we're looking at dealing with stress within our profession. Are GPs responsible for much of their own problems with high levels of perfectionism, competitiveness and self-criticism? Is there a tendency to adopt the wrong habits which only serve to perpetuate the problem? What can you do when you feel the tension building and you are ready to blow a gasket? Liz, what practically can we do to reduce the likelihood of suffering from stress?
Well, I think the first thing is to accept it, that this is a possibility and that we can feel that stress and start to look for it in ourselves with, as we said before, getting irritable, not doing hobbies. And then it's a matter really of getting a technique that suits you and employing it. And when I've had an irritating patient, as soon as they're out the door, I draw a picture of them. And I mean,
It's all very well if you can draw.
there's a drawer full of libelous pictures. You know, the defence lawyers never open my filing cabinets. I've stopped doing in the notes.
Yes.
And it's a matter then of finding a technique that works for you and applying it and remembering to apply it. And this comes back to teaching people in medical school, getting it in the training that we do suffer from stress, because if somebody comes along and unloads a problem onto you, you will feel bad because you've taken their problem. So you need to know how to handle the negative emotions that they've given you.
Before dealing with some of those ways of dealing with pressure and stress, Len, perhaps we could talk a little bit about prevention of it.
I think prevention is the important way of dealing with this problem. Okay, we've got stress. My way is to do something physically active and burn off the catechol. That means feel better and get on with the job. But in fact, I think from an occupational health point of view, we should look at preventing stress. And the most important thing is training so that people know how to do their job. I'm looking now at the whole primary care team, but also doctors. We're trained to be clinicians and physicians, and then we start doing all this paperwork that Liz keeps complaining about. Then, in fact, we need to look at organisational changes. What's the organisation asking us to do, and is it reasonable? If we actually have a workload that is not manageable, then we have to do something about it. And that's not an individual responsibility, it's an organisation. And so I think we have to ask health authorities, PCGs and practices to look at what we do. And it's just looking at it and quietly dealing with it. A quick example, I had a practice when I first launched this scheme, and the lad said, we are so busy running to standstill that we can't reorganise ourselves. I put a career start practice manager in to do an assessment for them, not for me, I didn't ever see it. I put a locum in so they could all give up the half day and have a meeting all together, and then I put the locum in for 2 days so the other 4 doctors got the half day back again. Total cost less than £1,000. 6 months later, they got a trainee doctor, a retainer doctor, to go in because she found it was a nice practice and all smiled. Now, it's a bit of organisation, a little bit of money, and, you know.
That's the bigger picture, but coming down to the individual GP, I know in practice, in the middle of a surgery, I might have a very, very stressful consultation with a patient, and how do I cope before I get on with the next patient? My own technique, I've got a couple of beautiful reproduction Monets in my room of beautiful colours, and I've taught myself over the years to, in 20 seconds, just disappear off into the colours, lose myself and come back, and I'm instantly relaxed again. That's my own technique. I suppose you might call it visualization, but I think there are a lot of other techniques that people can use between 5-minute consultations in order to relax themselves and then be able to give the next patient full benefit of their experience.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you've got to de-stress between patients, or else the next patient gets the burden that you got from the previous patient.
What other techniques are there? Perhaps it might be an idea just to look at some of these and give some idea as to what you can do.
Go out the room, quite often just actually leaving the surgery physically and just going out and maybe just go to the loo or just walk outside and then come back in again.
You have to come back, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Do you have any techniques, David?
Well, something that I found interesting was dealing with the emotional demands of the job, and I found that doctors who were able to compartmentalise their feelings did much better than ones that got over-involved with patients. So, you know, you'd have one doctor and he'd be very empathic to his patients and, you know, take it home with him and suffer problems related to that. But
there is some argument there that doctors that are more empathic actually suffer more from stress than those that are a little bit more blunt about things, perhaps.
Well, I think what you've got to do, you've got to be able to do the sort of humanistic bit relating to the patient in an expressive way. But when they go out the door, you've got to be able to switch off and not take it home with you. Yeah. And that seemed to be a very important skill that survivors had learned.
Are there very quick techniques that you can use? I mean, I have a busy morning surgery, 28 patients at sort of 5-minute intervals, and there isn't time to walk out of the room, go for a walk around the block. I've got my own technique, but it wouldn't work for everybody.
I think this compartmentalising your emotions thing isn't something you can learn particularly. It's a personality trait. You're either the sort of person who gets over-involved with their patients or you're not. I don't know if Liz knows techniques for dealing with that or not. But
I think it's difficult. I mean, certainly, as you say, the sensitive and empathetic doctors are the most at risk from depression, stress, breakdown, burnout, all those things. There's a lot of research to show that.
I still think we can teach them coping skills, and we should be doing small group work on personal development, coping skills, stress management, time management, all these things that they can be taught. I mean, I think I'm lucky. God gave me a little switch and it just flicks off when the patient walks out the door, and I don't think about them normally again until they come back. If I think about them between, it's a problem I couldn't solve, and I've had to try and, you know...
Are you still relaxed enough to then see the next patient?
Yeah.
Well, there's also a gender issue in that. A lot of the women GPs and the nurses I saw said they got a big share of the psychic consultations, that people would come to them with the big emotional, traumatic problems, and that they go to the men for the technical stuff. So I think, I don't know how you address that, whether it's through education or educating patients, but it seemed that women were getting a sort of unfair burden of emotional stress in the way that they were presented.
Perhaps we should have piped music in the rooms or something, that might help.
It's a personality thing. The patients know who's good at different things. You go to the patients where they're having morning coffee somewhere, and they'll give you a far better assessment of yourself and your partners than you'll ever get from yourself, because they know what you're good at and what you're not good at. They're just too polite, they don't tell you.
Vote with their feet.
What help does your organisation offer?
Well, we offer, it's a group of doctors, and it is just doctors. And it's a place where doctors can acknowledge they've had mental health problems, that they have suffered from stress. Because I think one of the big problems is still out there. It's unacceptable for a doctor to admit any kind of weakness, whether it's a mental health weakness or a physical weakness.
That goes back to our training there at medical school days.
That's right, and that training's got to change. We've got to accept that we can have bad days, good days, people wind us up, that we need techniques to cope with.
I went on a counselling course early in my career as a GP, and with another number of other GPs, and we all had to take time out to deal with something that we'd all carried from medical school, is that we'd been taught by humiliation and couldn't deal with it.
The whole National Health Service runs on that, name, shame and blame. But actually, David has a different view on counselling to the rest of us. He and I almost fell out in the car coming down here from Paddington, I have to say, because, in fact, I think good counselling is excellent, and also I use the same counsellors for these development groups, etc., whereas David thinks that we are medicalising problems, and he doesn't think that this is a good thing. He thinks we're actually damaging people's own coping mechanisms.
Perhaps he'd like to tell us what he thinks.
Well, I mean, from the people I've interviewed, I've found that there's a real reluctance to seek counselling help. And, I mean, that's often problematised by the sort of counselling establishment. They say, oh, you know, it's this macho culture or whatever. But I think it can be quite valuable because it's really about people valuing their own resilience. And if you take that away from them, if you medicalise their problems, they almost adopt a different self-identity. They think of themselves as a work stress victim who's not competent to deal with their own mental problems. And I think that can have very adverse consequences in the long term. You know, what we need to do is really sort of value people's ability to pull themselves together and deal with their problems.
Oh my God.
Oh, no, shall we both hit him?
I think so.
Do you have a quick response to that before we...
Well, I'm just speechless.
It's called spitting in the wind where I come from.
That's right.
Telling somebody to pull their socks up when they're in trouble.
That's right, and you're not depressed. Just get on with it.
Well, that's right, yes.
Good God, have some tablets.
In the army, they said, pull on your chin strap until you broke your neck. But don't worry, you know.
Yeah,
but I think it shows the cultural change that's taken place over the last 20 years, that to tell someone to pull themselves together is almost, you know, a taboo thing to do.
Yes.
It's
It
like
never
grossly
worked.
insensitive.
There are some of them who need it. It's called the counselling method of the steel toe cap.
I mean, it never worked then, and it's not going to work now.
Well,
We
encouraging
need to
people to
change
wallow
the
in their own
culture.
misery isn't going to help much either, I don't think.
No, people.
I'm afraid that's all we do have time for today. I'd like to thank my guests today, Dr. Len Featherstone, Chairman of GP Choices, Dr. David Wainwright, Research Fellow at the University of Kent, and Dr. Liz Armstrong, General Practitioner and founder of the Doctors Support Network. If you do feel that you are suffering from stress, or you think that a colleague may be suffering, then contact us at the address coming up shortly, and we'll put you in touch with various support groups. That's all for now. Join us again soon for another Synapse here on the Medical Channel. Bye for now.
If there is a topic you would like to see covered on Synapse, then please write to The Medical Channel, Teddington Studios, Broome Road, Teddington, Middlesex, TW11 9NT. Or you can phone us on 020 8943 1133 or email on editor@themedicalchannel.co.uk.